Well, the purpose of today's briefing is to give you a little bit of information on and updates on the tragic event of the past week that has claimed the lives of up to 78 civilians who we've lost in a very senseless act of violence that has been perpetrated in the Oromia region, in Harare region, and as well as in the Redhawa city. But before I get into the briefing, I think it's important to express my personal condolences, as well as on behalf of the Office of the Prime Minister, as well as the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia government, that we really want to express our condolences to the friends and families of those that have been affected by these senseless acts. No life is taken for granted, and we don't take any lives for granted as well. So I think it's also important to state that their lives also rest in peace. As a nation, these kind of incidents have a tendency to rattle many people, but at the same time, it's through these kind of incidents as well where we get to really evaluate how we respond and react to certain issues as well. It's also important, and I would like to highlight that we condemn these acts as well. These are senseless acts. They have resulted in the destruction of not only lives, but also the destruction of property, which really goes against the growth orientation and the growth path that this country is currently following. And particularly in a period of Ethiopia's history right now where so many spaces have opened up politically for people, for political parties, for individuals to engage in a meaningful way. And also when we have started the journey of embarking on really revitalizing and reviewing our economic potential and also strengthening our foreign relations. And really also focusing on this aspect of dialogue, where previous spaces did not allow for people to come together and engage in dialogue, where there's calls by the central government and also specifically by the Prime Minister to come sit at the table and share in ideas, being able to express discontent and express things that we do not agree with in a violent way, is really working against Ethiopia and working specifically against Ethiopians, all that people have labored for as well. It's also important for us to pay particular attention to people who have played a key role over the past week. We want to express gratitude to religious elders. We want to pray give gratitude to traditional elders who have done a lot of reconciliation work and convened dialogues. But at the same time, in addition to efforts by the federal government in partnership with the regional governments to attend to the destruction, there have been also local people, average people, volunteers who've engaged in supporting their fellow Ethiopians as well. So it's really important to highlight the role of these kind of volunteers and really celebrate them as well. So on behalf of the Prime Minister's office, we want to also express those thanks. With regards to the update on the post-violence work that has been done, following the violent conflict last week, which has claimed those lives, the federal and regional government have been working in sync to address the violence in 4 ways in particular. So the first primary task has been containing the violence. So per the request, because the federal government always enters regional governments per the request that they extend. So per the Oromia and Harare regional governments, the security apparatus and national defense forces, together with their regional counterparts, have been doing containment work to ensure that the violence doesn't spread, to ensure that the violence doesn't intensify and the destruction of lives and properties is not exacerbated. So the National Army was deployed to stop the instability and bring calm in Ambo, Bishoftu, Bale Robe, Dodola, Mojo, Adama, Redhawa, and Harar city upon the request of the regional governments and the city as well. So through this operation of containment, the security apparatus has been really successful in containing it and ensuring that the violence does not intensify. Although the violence did take on ethnic and religious component to it as well. So that containment work was one of the key interventions. The second work that has been done is in terms of bringing perpetrators into custody, and also the investigation work has begun, and this will continue. The latest information that I have in terms of perpetrators that have been apprehended is 409 individuals that have been apprehended. So these figures are also subject to change, obviously, as the investigation work continues and proceeds. But rest assured that the ongoing investigation work and the ongoing work to hold all perpetrators accountable is going to ensure that people who have committed these crimes and people who have been agents of perpetrating these crimes as well will also be held accountable. The third aspect is humanitarian support for victims of or survivors of the violence. So efforts by health workers, government health workers, in terms of tending to the needs, immediate needs of those that have survived the attacks has been ongoing. At the same time, there have been people that have also been displaced and their properties destructed as part of this. So there has been work again, on the invitation of the regional government for federal intervention to provide emergency food and non-food materials as well. So this has been also emergency assistance that has been going on over the past week. And lastly, a key component, and which is a key foundation to sustaining peace and stability, not only in these particular areas, but in the whole country itself, is the reconciliation work that elders, that national elders and traditional and religious leaders have been engaging with the affected communities. So these discussions are ongoing, and also high-level government officials, including the Prime Minister, have also gone to some of these locations as well and engaged with the local communities to understand what were the challenges, what are the divides, and be able to also address them. So these things will also continue because they're critical components of the peace-building work. I think it's also a little bit important to reflect on why these incidents happen, because there has been a recurrence of these kind of incidents, and there is a larger operating context which I think it's important to draw attention to. So the federal government does recognize that there are fundamental challenges that the country is faced with, including security threats as well. And it's a complex and dynamic environment that we're operating in. And noting the complexities and noting the demands that the country is faced at the moment, there has been a lot of short-term and long-term reforms that have been underway to address some of these challenges as well. So institution building has also been one key component of it, and particularly within the security apparatus and the security sector. But amidst these changing processes, however, there's also what we recognize to be significant obstructions that have been attempting to derail these reforms process. I don't think I need to draw your attention to the gains that have been made over the past year in terms of really opening up the spaces and attempting to nurture the democratization process and attempting to cater to a budding democracy. But there are also elements we're working to derail these reforms process and give the impression that the government is uncaring, that the government is weak. And many forces do want to force this kind of narrative as well. Because what thing that is very obvious, and which I think a lot of people have witnessed over the past year, is that this administration has really, really wanted to change the narrative of how Ethiopia has operated before. It has been an administration that has been advocating for peace. It has been an administration that has been advocating for reconciliation. Love and forgiveness have been part of the anchors of how this administration operates. Patience, and then also particularly bringing in the spirit of dialogue, has been a key component of this administration. So as we're moving along through these reforms processes, the patience that the central government has been showing, the federal government has been showing, has been utilized or usurped to give the impression of delegitimizing it, whereas this is an intentional strategy by the central government, because we do not want to take Ethiopia back to where it used to be. So any efforts to undermine these processes of reconciliation, peace, and the narrative and the new kind of hope that is being built in Ethiopia is being challenged as well. So the key challenges that we say that threaten this reforms process and are contributing to these incidents, One of them is, like I had mentioned already, involvement of forces aiming to undermine this progress for political gains as well, which is unfortunate because I think any kind of political gains or political power that can be claimed is dependent on ensuring that there's a unified country, that citizens are safe as well. So, innocent civilians and innocent citizens should not be sacrificed in order to bring about political gains. So there is no doubt there are forces continuously working to undermine the current reforms as well. And we are cognizant of the fact that these are fueled by a number of factors. And again, not excluding this push to create a climate of fear, to create a climate of, or to instill feelings of hopelessness among people, specifically because a lot of hope has been built over the past year, and this hope is not empty. There have been visible gains to why people have been hopeful as well. So people or agents working to undermine these efforts are also trying to derail the reforms process. At the same time, I was also saying the new administration's commitment to democratizing and identifying various forms of oppression. As you know, this administration has been very honest about some of the egregious human rights violations that had happened before as well, and has owned up to them, and as a result has made tremendous shifts in terms of really trying to turn around the narrative of Ethiopia as a human rights violating country. So these things and these attempts are also perceived as a threat and fueling this fear and narrative. At the same time, there are also efforts to push divides between leadership as well. And so these are also factors that are manifesting in why such incidents are also occurring. The second aspect, and which I'm not going to delve much into because the political parties, the spokesperson, are responsible to speaking to that, but part of why we're seeing why we're seeing is also a backlash to the current acceleration to unify the main party or the ruling party. But I think because there's also a narrative around the moves to unify the party that are being spun that are misrepresentative of what the true intentions of these moves are. And it's also important to give it context because within the past year and a half of the political space also opening up, we've seen a number of groups also registering as political parties. So we have seen an increase of political parties that are registering over 130. So I think in a country like Ethiopia, the move to unify parties, or the call that has been made by the Prime Minister as well as the federal government for political parties to come together, to coalesce, to merge coalitions and merge into larger groups is really a critical factor to Ethiopia's stability, to Ethiopia's unity, and ensuring that there's diversity of ideas, that these ideas are not fragmented and fractured over more than 130 parties, but really bringing in key policy options, key ideological options as well. So, but nevertheless, we see the continuation of such violent acts as a response to resisting the merger of the ruling party. And they're labeled as anti-federalist or unitary as well, which is a very erroneous, again, assumption in terms of the true intentions. If at all, the merger of the ruling party is going to facilitate more alignment between the federal government and the regional governments. It's going to facilitate or encourage the strengthening of federalism and the true application of federalism within Ethiopia, rather than this perspective that it's a unitary and anti-federalist approach. And at the end of the day, it's also really important to highlight that the federal system is not something that any particular person or group can snatch from Ethiopians. The Ethiopian people have paid a huge sacrifice for the gains that have been made up to today, including the design of the federal system as well. And if anything, there are efforts and there's a commitment from the federal government as well as the ruling party to be able to encourage the strengthening of the federal system and the right application of the federal system. Finally, the third challenge around this is related to mindsets as well, and we cannot really undermine the extent to which assumptions, perspectives, and entrenched attitudes that now with the change of various thought processes within the country that are manifesting in different reforms, that would be a challenge in of itself as well, something that we've accumulated over time. And the importance of these mindsets is that they're reflected in our institution building, or the stresses that are on our institutions. They're also reflected through our democratic processes, or a regression by some groups as well in terms of these democratic processes. And they're also may interfere in terms of people's or the government striving for prosperity as well. So that is one critical challenge, but it's not a challenge that is not being addressed. In fact, one of the key priorities of this administration is really to work on those aspects as well, because ensuring that a united Ethiopia, or an Ethiopia in which people have a united perspective, not necessarily united and have the same ideas and so on, but particularly in terms of a shared vision and a shared goal, is something that will guarantee the stability of the country as well. So this attitude towards how we perceive each other, how we engage with each other as well, and how we think our institutions should function, and how we work towards strengthening and utilizing institutions to bring about the changes that we want, is also something that is being critically addressed. So at a time when the government is working for democracy, working for peace, prosperity, human rights, such incidents do become barriers to growth as well, and we do recognize that. And it's also a call upon different stakeholders to really support in terms of nurturing, the gains that have been made over the past year and a half. Again, like I had said, there have been a lot of sacrifices that have been paid to bring about these changes as well. With regards to what are the measures that have been undertaken in terms of ensuring stability and peace, and ongoing measures as well, I just want to highlight a few ones, and then during our Q&A we could also address some of them. But number one is the commitment from the government in terms of maintaining the rule of law is still there. It's still very strong, as evidenced through the work that has been done over the past week in terms of bringing or apprehending those that are responsible for these acts. But also, if you look at the past year and a half with such similar incidents, about 3,000 or more than 3,000 people have been apprehended for the crimes that they have committed in these kind of violent acts as well over the past year and a half. So this is a critical figure that shows you that the security apparatus as well as the rule of law bodies are also functioning across the federal and the regional states, although sometimes they might not be highlighted, giving the impression that this work is not happening. Secondly, with regards to reforms that I had been talking about, the security apparatus is one component or an institution that has been a main focus of reforms as well, to ensure that the fear-mongering narrative that we've had before, to ensure that the institution that has been a source of terrorizing people as well, engaging in bodily harm to people as well, and really threatening the existence of people who may have been perceived to work against the state at some point in time. So as to change that impression, there's been a lot of work, and there's still ongoing work within the security sector apparatus to change that. Particularly, you would see this evidenced within NIS as well. Second one is in terms of capacity building. This is always going, capacity building measures to ensure that law enforcement entities are well capacitated to attend to their needs. The third one is related to introducing technology and sufficiently utilizing technology, particularly for early warning and ensuring that there's efforts that are put in place to mitigate certain incidents. And again, we have a tendency to really only see those that have passed the early warning stage and have blown into violence, but through the Ministry of Peace and through some of the early warning systems and through the interaction of the security apparatus, there have been a lot of cases that would have blown out of proportion and caused harm to people that have been contained because of this effective early warning system that has been utilized. The other component is with regards to the continuing peace building work that is being done with the federal government and the regional governments as well. And this peace-building work has been identified because some of the manifestations or how some of these violent acts are perpetuated are related to an erosion of social capital an erosion of some of Ethiopia's, the assets that we have as Ethiopians as well. So ensuring that peace building work is working through indigenous systems, traditional systems that we have in place, reviving those, and ensuring that these are functional as well has been one of the critical factors and work that the government has been working on. And lastly, with regards to this, Maddamer as an idea, Maddamer as a roadmap is also attempting to fill in the deficit in a new social, political, and economic and foreign relations orientation for the country as well. And as a thought process or as an idea, the Maddamer philosophy is also really looking at how we can bring people in a united in a manner. How can we engage with individuals within society, and how can we use different institutions to really bring into perspective all of the assets that we have together, looking at our past experiences, looking at all of the grave historical or looking back into the historical grievances that we may have had, and then really correcting them as well. So these are some of the things that are being done with regards to the federal government to ensure that peace is a sustainable aspect or a sustainable part of the fabric of Ethiopia. So I think I'll stop here. There are other actors as well that we do call upon to engage, particularly the media as well, in terms of what is the responsibility of media to effectively build peace or be part of the peace building narrative. Same with political parties and political leaders, their role, particularly in unifying, divided societies and not using circumstances for political gains. Role of the general public in terms of being vigilant about destructive narratives and divisive narratives as well. Again, the civil society is also playing or has to also play a much more strengthened role. Because now the civil society space has really been opened up as well, but they also play a critical factor in strengthening and sustaining peace within the country. So let me stop here. I'm sure you have many questions, and I'll open it up to first 4 in the first round. I'll start with one here.
People out there who criticize this administration for being weak, reluctant, or even being downright unable to name names.
Downright?
Unable to not able to name names and in the process of investigation and bringing culprits to the court of law. Thank you.
Thank you. Robbie?
Robbie, at the events of last week, does the government consider Jawar Mohammed to be responsible or accountable at all for what happened? And if so, are there any plans to take measures against him? Secondly, you mentioned the proposed merger of the EPRDF. How do the events of last week affect the timeline of that, and how does the criticism from people like Mr. Jawar affect the timeline?
Addressed unnamed media owners in his speech to Parliament, and the day after, the same night, the events that led to the protests unfolded. Is the government gonna comment on, basically the link between the Prime Minister's speech and Jawar Mohammed and what happened the next day? Is there any link? Is there any government involvement in what happened and his security details allegedly removed from his house? And also with respect to the merger of the EPRDF, constitutionally, how is this going to work if one of the 4 members of the ruling coalition already said that they are not on board with this merger?
Okay, so let me respond to these ones, and I will continue. To begin with the question here with regards to some of the questions are actually related, so I'll address them in chunk. The perspective that government is weak, unable to name names, again, going back to the week, I had mentioned earlier on that there is a narrative to describe it that way. But again, an anchor and a principle that this government is going to follow, because we really don't want to regress, or the government does not want to regress to the patterns of before. There are pushes. These kind of incidents may give indication that government will be pushed to go back to despotic tendencies, but there is a commitment from the Prime Minister, there is a commitment from the federal government to continue on the reforms process, because there is a commitment to Ethiopians to not go back to the violation of human rights, to not go back to those anti-democratic tendencies. So all of the sacrifices that have been paid over the past year and a half will be null and void if those kind of things go back. So if reconciliation, if pushing for forgiveness, if pushing for patience in a highly dynamic and complicated environment is considered weak, then I'm afraid it's very hard to define what strong would be, because this is not something, if the previous way of treating citizens, if the previous despotic mannerisms were considered strong, then this is not the kind of style that this government is committed to. Because democracy is something that is going to be working on, and this is something that it is continuously going to be committed to. With regards to individuals, this is really not about particular individuals as well. This is also systemic. So it's not about naming and not naming, but it's important for the due process of investigations to go through as well. As I had mentioned, so far up to now, we have 409. That doesn't mean that have been apprehended. It doesn't mean that the investigation stopped there. There is continuing. So anybody, according to the evidence that's gathered, that shows that there's any relationship to that, will all be apprehended, and the rule of law would be enforced. So accountability is not something that's that is not going to be addressed as well. With regards to the questions related to the EPRDF merger, as I had given a disclaimer when I began, I cannot speak on behalf of the party as well. So best that these information with regards to further details on the merger be achieved through other channels as well. Iskandar, you asked about particular details in terms of what had happened that night, and I don't have any additional information to give because this has been sufficiently addressed by the Federal Police Commissioner. So the details surrounding that is something that is maintained through what he had already shared as well. So let me take a few other questions, if there are any.
Vincent from Radio France International. You just said that the police commissioner, his speech is addressed to the media is sufficient, but a few hours later, Shimles Abdesa, the president of the acting president of the region of Oromia, he said that there was a big mistake, or mistake, depending on the translation. So, if there was a mistake, if someone from ODP close to Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister, said that there is a mistake, how do you explain the difference between the speech of the Federal Police Commissioner and the speech of Ato Shimles? Okay.
I can't respond to what the regional president had said. Because we're representing the federal government. But this is something that Iskandar had also picked up upon, and what I want to be able to address. In terms of the discrepancies, we do recognize that, and it's not the first time that there have been discrepancies and misalignment in terms of information between the regional and federal government, as well as other entities and bodies within the federal government. We attribute this challenge to the need to want to be able to give timely information, also coupled with the challenges that come with being able to get information timely as well. So this is something that has been identified as a challenge, and we recognize that it exists. The press secretariat particularly has recognized this as well and has been taking steps and is also working to ensure that, particularly in times of crisis where people are where people are affected by what's going on, the manner in which information is gathered and articulated to ensure that the public is informed with accurate information. We're working through that process to streamline it. So this is as far as I'll be able to say on this one. Any other questions? Okay, if not, I'll take one more and then I'll wrap it up then.
Maybe I heard some allegations that in the process of apprehending the suspects, there have been people being victimized, people who really were defending public infrastructures were being tracked down and taken. What?
So according to the information that I've received, again, this is information that has been populated between federal law enforcement agents and regional law enforcement agents. The commitment is there to apprehend people that were involved, and these 409 are those that have been identified as having been caught red-handed. So in that process, because the investigation is still ongoing as well, in that process there might be some sifting, so I can't really particularly comment to that. But what I can tell you is that the 409 are those that have been identified by regional and federal security officers as having been caught red-handed perpetuating these acts. One more? Iskander. Iskander, I think, I don't know, it might be a little bit too early to say that, because this is something that's still happening in real time as well, apprehending people. So once the investigations are out and the results might not be acceptable, then that is another layer or another process in order to entertain that aspect of it. But right now, the government is fulfilling its responsibility of ensuring that those perpetrators are apprehended and are going the due process of investigation. So the briefing is contained to this. Okay. If there's anything else, so you're more than happy. I'm more than happy to receive email questions, and for other subjects, we'll be able to respond to it. Thank you very much.